Good afternoon. How is everybody? Good? I don't hear a lot. Thank you. I'm super excited to be here with you today to talk about search for greatness. This is a really important topic for me because talent, hopefully, is very democratic, right, and how it identifies people. Opportunity, however, isn't. So what I want to do for the next half hour is really talk about the way in which we want to democratize opportunity in our organizations. Okay, let's jump in. So first, what I want to do is I want to start with some lessons from baseball. Baseball is kind of the Americanized version of cricket. I have to confess, I am not really a fan of baseball, but I'm talking about it for three specific reasons. One is my husband. My husband is from Oakland, California, and he is a lifelong Oakland A's fan. Oakland A's is the baseball team that is in Oakland, California. The second reason is Brad Pitt. I am also a lifelong Brad Pitt fan. Now, typically it would be very hard to get me to go see any kind of movie about sports, but if you put Brad Pitt in it, you might get me to go and watch. And finally, recruiting, because baseball is really about recruiting. In Major League Baseball in the US, it's a $10 billion industry. There are more than 500 million fans all over the world, and about 1,200 baseball players who will decide the outcome of every single season. Baseball also has its own specialized recruiter called a scout. So here we have a recruiting card from 1954 for a player, Sandy Koufax. Sandy Koufax was considered to be the greatest pitcher of his era. The pitcher was basically the person that bowls the ball. So imagine the recruiter or the scout that was able to find this talent. And recruiting performance, also interestingly, is very transparent because everything is measurable. So scouts actually had a lot of information at their disposal to make decisions. But after nearly a century, the era of the scout was coming to an end. So because I am married to an Oakland A's fan and a lifelong Brad Pitt fan, I already know the answer to what happened, which is that scouts were replaced by data. In 2002, Michael Lewis wrote a book called Moneyball that was actually focused on the Oakland A's baseball team. And really, they were able to have a pretty significant season despite the fact that they didn't have a lot of resources. And what Michael Lewis wrote is that Moneyball is, in my mind, mainly about the way that markets misvalue people. There are some really good baseball players who were underappreciated, and other not-so-good baseball players who were being completely overvalued. So in order for the Oakland A's strategy to work, there were two things that had to be true. One is that data had to be predictive of performance, which is not always the case, and that is what the Oakland A's found out. There were certain statistics that had been used historically to determine the success of baseball players that just wasn't really indicative. The second is that scouts had to be wrong in predictable ways. So why were the scouts so systematically wrong? And I think that's really the interesting question. And here we have a response from Nobel Prize-winning economist Richard Thaler and his research partner Cass Sunstein. And what they say is the problem is not that baseball professionals are stupid, hopefully no one thinks that, it is that they are human. Like most people, including experts, they tend to rely on simple rules of thumb, on traditions, on habits, on what other experts seem to believe. And as we think about the history of baseball scouts, it's impossible not to ask whether there are lessons that we can learn about recruiting as well. So that brings me to three questions I really want to explore for the next 20 minutes or so. Is it possible that our recruiting practices are vulnerable to the same simple rules of thumbs, traditions, and habits? Are we making the same mistakes in assessing talent? And if so, what can we do to more consistently and fairly identify greatness? So in order to answer these questions, we really need to understand how people make complex decisions, particularly about humans. So how do we make decisions? I think a great way to illuminate this is to look at 3 scientific experiments and the challenges with human judgment. So the first is the power of first impressions. So I'm going to start with the human question about recruiting. How long does it typically take us to assess someone's character, their competence, their trustworthiness, their likability? Is it a week? Does it take a day to really get to know someone? Or maybe an hour, the time of a typical interview? Actually, we make lasting decisions about people in less than a second. So here we have a quote from Professor Alexander Todorov, and he says, "We form impressions after seeing a face in less than 1/10 of a second. We decide not only on whether the person is attractive, but also whether he or she is trustworthy, competent, extroverted, or dominant. We do this instinctively with very little information, and these first impressions have real-world consequences." Again, with Professor Todorov, unlucky people who appear untrustworthy are more likely to get harsher legal punishments. Those who appear trustworthy are more likely to get loans on better financial terms. Politicians who appear more competent are more likely to get elected, and military personnel who appear more dominant are more likely to achieve higher ranks. And of course, these instinctive first impressions are almost always wrong. And this brings us to our second experiment, the limits of rational thought. So here we have a quote from Elizabeth Kolbert. She's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, and she wrote in The New Yorker that, "As anyone who has followed the research, even occasionally picked up a copy of Psychology Today knows, any graduate student with a clipboard can demonstrate that reasonable-seeming people are often completely irrational." So here we have Professors Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman. And their research and experiments really changed the way the world thinks about the predictable flaws in human decision-making. So Daniel Kahneman wrote this book called Thinking Fast and Slow. I'm not sure if some of you have read it, but in that book, he has an experiment with the Wheel of Fortune, which we see here, numbered from 0 to 100, kind of like a wheel you would see in a lot of games or game shows. But this wheel was rigged so that it only stopped on the numbers 10 or the number 65. So in the experiment, what they had people do was roll the wheel and then write down the number. And then they asked them 2 questions. One is the percentage of African nations among UN members larger or smaller than the number you wrote? And what is your best guess of the percentage of African nations in the UN? Now, this wheel has no useful information whatsoever. They should have just ignored it, but they did not. In fact, the number had a dramatic effect on what their response was. If the wheel landed on 10, they estimated that 25% of African nations were in the UN. If it landed on 65, they estimated that 45% of African nations were in the UN. And they were able to go on and do an array of different experiments. This just happens to be one, and it would basically lead Daniel Kahneman to win the Nobel Prize. His research partner, Amos Tversky, would have as well if he had been alive, I'm sure. The third experiment is that via halo effects, questionable decisions cascade. So what do we mean by that? In 1920, Edward Thorndike studied the assessments of military personnel by their commanding officers on 4 dimensions. They were leadership, character, intelligence, and physique. So what would you expect, right, if you were assessing people on those 4 attributes? Maybe someone has great character and great leadership and great intelligence, but not so great physique. They just need to go to the gym and they'll be fine. Well, that is not what Thorndike found. What he found was that officers usually judged his men as all good or all bad right across the board. There was little mixing across those 4 attributes. And how can this be? right? Do intelligent people have better character? Do people in poor physical shape have poor leadership characteristics? Of course not. But we have an answer from psychology today. And what psychology today says is that it has long been noted that people tend to view others holistically, that is, as all good or all bad. This is referred to as the halo effect, because often it seems one characteristic, albeit positive or negative, seems to outshine others and bias our perspective in the respective direction. Not surprisingly, the soldiers that were found to be taller and more attractive were also rated as more intelligent and more dominant. Do we think this happens in our workplaces at all, where someone is rated as all good or all bad? Well, here's Gallup. They quoted an article from the New York Times, and it said that tall people earn on average $789 more per inch than their shorter counterparts. Is there any increase in productivity because someone is taller? Absolutely not. Employers have basically just decided to pay a premium to their taller employees. That's it. It's a tall tax. So how do these forces impact our hiring decisions? Right? Are we also vulnerable to some of these things that we're talking about? And for that, we want to think about how we make hiring decisions. So first impressions, stereotypes in appearance, random inputs and halo effects. All of those things absolutely affect the hiring process, from the job description to the way someone is interacting with your career site or your company page, the way we source and screen, all the way through the interview to when we make that job offer. But in particular, there are 5 critical moments where systematic human bias can unintentionally eliminate greatness. The first is when a candidate views a job description. And the job description is usually when a candidate gets their first impression of your company's values and your company's culture. And word choice, the research shows, can really have a dramatic effect. So in order to understand this more, Indeed asked about 266 job seekers who were turned off by content why they ultimately decided not to apply. And this is what we found. The number one reason, 69%, was that they were concerned about the stability of the company. Now, I sincerely doubt any organization is writing in their job description that they're going to be insolvent anytime soon. So how do they get to this conclusion? They're paying a lot of attention to the words that we're using and extracting meaning in that way. It could also be the case in this situation that it's a brand that they don't recognize. Number 2 is their values and beliefs did not align with the company's mission or values, and they did not feel they would be a good cultural fit. And all of this is based on the words that are used and the language that is being used. So sometimes job descriptions can unintentionally limit our talent pool in really obvious ways. Take a job description, right? Sometimes those are crafted very quickly, but they can have a really significant impact on how a candidate views your organization. Here we have some job descriptions. Here's one for product manager. We are a young, hungry, and fast-growing company. We move quickly, work hard, play hard, etc. Who do we think this is going to be attractive to? Probably to a younger job seeker. That kind of sounds like what they're going for. This one isn't so subtle. Looking for millennials, right? They're being very overt in who they are trying to attract in their job descriptions. But sometimes it happens in more subtle ways. Here's one for sales ninja. Ninja is a title that we found in our research that is more likely to appeal to men than women. And even school teacher, using words like interpersonal skills, supportive, collaborative, tend to be more attractive to female job seekers. And it's not just about the words, it can also be about the number of qualifications. Here is a job description that we pulled from our platform. It has quite an array of different qualifications. What we found, and this is research coming out of Harvard University with Iris Bonnet, and what she says is that many women won't apply for a job unless they meet almost all of the listed requirements. Men tend to have a lower threshold for applying. I think the research shows that women will apply if they meet about 100% of the qualifications. Men are 60%. So be very thoughtful about whether or not this is a must-have or a want-to-have. The second moment is how we source candidates. So of course, we know that job seekers are leveraging connections. About 45% say that they always look for a personal or professional connection to a job when they are applying. And employers also love referrals, and the data shows that. 51% say that they absolutely rely on referrals to find applicants to fill their roles. And 84% say that candidates that referrals return are qualified or extremely qualified. But there is some risk here, because referrals from employees' social and professional networks attract a subset of the population. What this means is that referrals tend to be very similar to the people who refer them. And there's actually research in the US around this as well. When you hold everything constant, female and minority applicants are much less likely to get referrals than white male applicants. And then even within referrals, white male referrals tend to make more money than female referrals. Our third moment is when we are screening candidates. So when we screen candidates, what we're trying to do is we're trying to very quickly look at a candidate's profile or resume and assess whether or not they're going to be a good fit for the role that we're trying to hire. So what job seekers have told us is they spend about 10 to 30 minutes updating their resume whenever they apply for a new job. We asked them, well, how long do you think employers spend reviewing your resume? Their response was 10 minutes, but they are not right. The research shows, and this is with gaze tracking, that the average recruiter spends about 6 seconds reviewing a resume. And they're basically looking at 4 things. They're looking at their name, they're reviewing their previous company and job titles, their position start and end dates, and their education. So they have about a second left to review all the other information on that resume. Now, the problem with quick decisions is that we have to rely on social signals and stereotypes to give us information, and we don't have the time to focus on those nuances that are going to tell us if someone has the right skills for the job that we're trying to fill. The fourth moment is the interview, right? Interviews are critically important. 72% say that in-person interviews enable employers to more accurately reflect their skills. But we've just been talking about some of the challenges with first impressions and face-to-face interactions. It's difficult to ignore them and to focus on skills and qualifications during the interview process. So in a famous experiment, Tricia Prickett is a psychology student, and she collected a series of videotaped interviews. And she wanted to know whether it's possible to guess the outcome of an interview by simply observing the interactions between the interviewer and the interviewee. And what she found was that she could predict whether or not an interviewee would be offered the job by watching the first 15 seconds of the interview. So basically, the initial introduction and the handshake was enough for them to predict with a pretty high rate of accuracy whether or not they were going to be offered the job. And then moment number 5, the hiring decision. So managers tend to favor candidates that are like them, and I think we all do this. We're actually very interested in this, and here's a quote from Lauren Rivera, who's from the Northwestern Kellogg School of Management, and she says, in the absence of concrete answers to interview questions and reliable predictors of future performance, assessors purposefully use their own experiences as models of merit. So essentially what we do is we fill in the gaps. We like someone, we ask them a question, they don't give us exactly the answer that we wanted or that we were expecting, and we tend to fill it in with our own background and experience, or what we thought that they were planning to say or wanted to say. So we asked managers basically to get an idea of, is this true? And what we did is we asked managers if they went to a top school. For the ones that self-identified as going to a top school, they were more likely to say that they only like to hire candidates from top schools. On the flip side, for managers who self-identified as not going to a top school, they were more likely to value experience over education. And here's a quote from one of the employers that we interviewed. Knowing that the person has gone through a similar background that I have, similar training, similar education, that's a plus. So when it comes to effectively and fairly evaluating candidates, we still have a long way to go. With each recruiting decision that we make, we inadvertently narrow our talent pool. Some of this is because of the predictable flaws in how we make decisions. We might be favoring one candidate over another. We're appealing to some great candidates and not others. We also have our own unintentional biases, so that at the end, we end up with a good candidate. But what happens is that over time, smarter organizations are going to gain a competitive advantage, because they're going to figure out a way to more fairly identify the absolute best person for the job. So what we wanted to do is to think about how can we actually eliminate bias from the hiring process. So we developed 4 strategies to help organizations eliminate bias and focus on organizations, and we did this in partnership with some recruiters. So the first is to focus on skills and qualifications and hide biasing information. So back in May of 2018, we had Interactive Worldwide in Austin, Texas. We had about 2,000 people from all over the world, and we actually got an opportunity to talk to some recruiters and ask them. Alyssa Brown was from Global Imaging Systems, and her suggestion was to present candidate bios without info prone to bias, name, address, school. Someone else said, just send them into the interview, don't give the hiring manager the resume in advance. And that was a pervasive theme, this notion of masking resumes. And Alexander Todorov, again, the expert on first impressions, really echoes this. We need to structure decisions so that we have access to valid information and minimize the access to appearance information. Another great example are orchestras in the US. So until recently, the orchestras were almost exclusively populated by men until they decided to do blind auditions. So they literally took place behind a giant screen. And that is when the number of women in orchestras started to increase. Many organizations are already starting to implement this. They're blinding things like name, gender, address, age, even school or years of experience in some situations. Deloitte UK went university blind because they wanted to make sure that they were identifying candidates who had potential over polish. Our second strategy is to gather diverse opinions. So here we have another recruiter from Whole Foods. Whole Foods is a grocery chain in the US, recently purchased by Amazon. And what Avery said, Avery Gustovich, our organization uses a peer model for hiring, where all levels are included in the final hire decision. This allows for all members to be attached and responsible for everyone's success within the department. Within the department store and on, value is placed on many voices involved in an individual's success. Also, we have this from Working Mother, a quote. A number of companies, including Accenture and Procter & Gamble, are also starting to do this. They're requiring candidates to be considered and interviewed by a diverse group of interviewers. And by doing this, you can hopefully eliminate the unconscious bias of one person or another person. CA Technologies has seen the number of female employees increase 1% year over year since requiring diverse slates of candidates in 2013 and diverse interview panels a year later. Our third strategy is to allow alternative candidates to follow alternative paths. So traditional resume-driven processes can lead employers to overlook great candidates with untraditional backgrounds. So Automatic is a web-based company. They're the company behind WordPress. And since 2005, they have hired about 40% of people in their organization based on tryouts. Even at Indeed, we recently eliminated the college degree requirement for more than 3,000 job profiles. And that's interesting as a hiring manager. All of a sudden, as a hiring manager, a recruiter will ask, is a college degree required? Your automatic response is yes. But at least in this scenario, it begs you to be a little bit more thoughtful and reflective of, is it actually required for this role and for this function? And then finally, design an evaluation process that is predictive of performance. So in 2016, Dr. Frank Schmidt of the University of Iowa released a comprehensive meta-analysis of more than 100 years of research on hiring practices. His research basically found three things: that the impact of hiring the right person in their job is significant, basically wait for the right person. Job performance can be predicted by many of the things that we do right now. And then the benefits of improving hiring are significant, right? And basically what he says, the gains from increasing the validity of hiring methods can amount to over literally millions of dollars. And if you're a larger organization, that can be hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars. So what he did is he looked at 31 discrete attributes, everything from structured interviews, unstructured interviews, all the way to GPA and age. And he linked them to post-hire performance. So what you see is that all the way over is 0% is not predictive of job performance, and then to the left, 100% is perfectly predictive of job performance. So the one thing that is not at all predictive of job performance is age. So the job description looking for millennials, they've just narrowed their talent pool for no reason whatsoever. The next 5 things are in the lower category: extroversion, years of education, emotional stability, person-organization fit, job experience. It's kind of a strange mix of things, but it is interesting to see how poorly correlated tenure, years of experience, years of education are to post-hire performance. Those tend to be ways that we try to assess someone's competence, but they're not really about competence. Now we get to some of the workhorses of the things that we typically do when we're hiring. Reference checks, which have actually gone down in their predictive ability over time. Work sample, GPA, job tryout procedure, that can also differ based on the type of role, if it's a highly specialized role. Job knowledge tests, peer ratings, phone interviews. But the 3 things that are most able to predict post-hire performance are interviews, structured and unstructured, both at 56%, and then a general mental ability test. And that tends to skew a little bit higher when we're talking about job type. If we're talking about unskilled, it's really about 39%. When we're talking about managerial or professional jobs, that's over 70%. When you can actually increase the predictive value, however, by combining indicators. And the 3 that you should actually combine are a general mental ability test, an integrity test, and a general mental ability test, integrity test, and an intellectual test, an IQ test, are actually not necessarily always correlated, but they are highly complementary. So that's something that's kind of interesting. So general mental ability test, integrity test, and a structured interview. When we start to look at them in combination, a structured interview is more predictive than unstructured. Unstructured is really just going to predict someone's ability to quickly respond to a random set of stimuli. So when we have these 3 things, a lot of the other things really become superfluous. Peer ratings, which we typically use for internal candidates, work sample, job tryout procedures, again, in certain situations, maybe for a software engineer, a coding challenge would be appropriate, job knowledge tests, and GPAs. So what is the impact of implementing these 4 strategies? If we do all these things, if we focus on skills and qualifications and hide biasing information, if we gather diverse opinions, if we allow alternative candidates to follow alternative paths, and design an evaluation that is predictive of performance, if we do all of these things, we can really grow a more diverse and inclusive workplace. And we can find and hire great talent, and in doing so, achieve greatness for ourselves and for our organizations. So throughout your careers, the people in this room are going to hire a lot of people. You're going to change a lot of lives. So I'd really encourage you with your peers over the course of today and tomorrow to share a secret with your peers about how you've been able to minimize unconscious bias in your organizations and really sort of minimize recruiting bias and error. I will be around for the rest of the day, so if you have any questions, please feel free to come up and ask me anything. Hopefully this was insightful, and thank you all.